Hello, I'm John McGovern, and today I'm going to be discussing Book 5, the penultimate book of Edmund Spenser's epic poem, The Faerie Queene. We talked in previous videos about the importance of historical allegory in The Faerie Queene. So it's made up of different allegorical layers. So the literal fairy story means lots of different things at the same time. So often there's a moral allegory with some kind of moral significance, and also a historical allegory referring to historical events, and also to events contemporaneous with the poem. And we haven't talked that much about historical allegory in the past 2 or 3 videos because historical allegory is most well developed in books 1 and book 5. So as you will see today, we have a lot more to say about historical allegory. The main knight of the book is Artegall, who married Britomart in the previous book, and he's accompanied by an iron man called Talus. And Talus is based on the Greek figure of Talos, who is an automaton made of bronze, and he's described, for instance, in the Greek epic poem Argonautica. These 2 characters were painted by a painter called John Hamilton Mortimer in the 18th century, which is now owned by the Tate system of galleries, but it's not on display at the moment, probably because they had a much superior work to display in its place. Artegall carries a sword, the sword of justice, called Chrysaor, and Talus represents the executive power which is needed to give justice teeth. So you've got justice on one hand and the power which justice requires on the other hand. And these 2 characters work in harmony. At the same time, as we said, there's a historical allegory. So Artegall also represents Arthur Grey, Lord Grey of Wilton, who served as Lord Deputy of Ireland from 1580 to 1582, and Spenser served as Grey's secretary. And Grey was a very controversial figure in his role in Ireland, and Spenser helped to defend Grey from the slander, as he saw it, of his enemies. For example, Spenser wrote a tract called A Present View of Ireland, in which he defended the seemingly cruel actions of Grey. Book 5 is very complicated, and Spenser is doing lots of things at the same time. But it's worth bearing in mind that one of his purposes is to defend Grey's policy in Ireland. W.B. Yeats, the famous poet, wrote in 1902, "When Spenser wrote of Ireland, he wrote as an official, and out of thoughts and emotions that had been organised by the state. He was the first of many Englishmen to see nothing but what he was desired to see." And he went on to say so that Spenser was the first poet who gave his heart to the state, saw nothing but disorder in Ireland. I'm going to try not to get embroiled in the politics of this too much, but it is worth bearing in mind that this book is treating of a subject which was very controversial in the Elizabethan period and remains controversial to this day. In Canto 1 of the book, Artegall receives his quest from the Faerie Queene to rescue a woman called Irena from a terrible giant called Grantorto, and Irena represents Ireland, and Grantorto represents the principle of might is right, or lawlessness. Spenser tells us that Artegall was brought up from his boyhood by a goddess called Estrella, who taught him all of the principles of justice. There she taught him to weigh both right and wrong, in equal balance with due recompense, and equity to measure out along, according to the line of conscience, when so it needs with rigour to dispense. Of all the which, for want thereof mankind, she caused him to make experience upon wild beasts which he in woods did find, with wrongful power oppressing others of their kind. So an interesting idea there that he'd practiced bringing justice to beasts, animals who had disagreements amongst themselves. What does Spenser mean by equity? Equity was a branch of jurisprudence which adjudged cases according to conscience rather than to the strict letter of the law. And equity was used where it was thought that judging a case according to common law would have led to an unfair result. So it was an alternative way of judging a case where you could use a different system to get a fairer result. It was typified in the Elizabethan period by the Court of Chancery, where litigants could turn to have their case heard in equity. As they begin their quest, Artegall and Talus come across a squire weeping on the ground and a decapitated lady. And the squire says that the lady had belonged to a bloody knight called Sir Sanglia. And Sir Sanglia had a lady of his own, and the squire had his own lady. And Sir Sanglia had wanted to swap the ladies for some reason, and the squire had refused. But Sir Sanglia had forcibly swapped the ladies, so the squire was left with Sir Sanglia's lady, and Sir Sanglia had the squire's lady. But as Sir Sanglier was riding off on horseback with the other lady, his own lady followed, crying, asking to be taken back, and Sir Sanglier took out his sword and cut off her head. Sir Sanglier argues that the new lady, the squire's lady, belongs to him by right, and the squire knows that this is a falsehood, but he is too weak to hazard a trial by combat, so he simply agrees that Sir Sanglier is right. But Artegall sees through this, and he realizes the truth. He realizes that Sir Sanglier is simply enforcing his right by might, and so he makes a kind of test. He says that the two ladies, the decapitated lady and the living lady, should both be cut in half, and half of each lady should be delivered to half of each lady should be delivered to the squire, and half of each lady should be delivered to Sir Sanglier. And Sir Sanglier says, "Okay, that's a fine idea," and the squire says, "Well, he opposes the idea." And this is based on a story from the Bible. Many of you will know it in the book of First Kings, chapter 3, where Solomon judges a case between two prostitutes in a similar way, and by judging the case in equity in this way, Artegall brings to light that Sir Sanglier is the wicked, the wrongdoer of the situation, and the squire gets his rightful lady, and Sir Sanglier is punished. In Canto 2, Artegall defeats a pagan called Polente, and Polente means something like plunderer, and Polente keeps a bridge, and he doesn't allow anyone to pass without paying an extortionate toll. And the lesson is that the poor need to be protected from exploitation and extortion from wealthier classes. Artegall kills Polente and Polente's daughter, who represents the taking of a bribe. Continuing on their way, they come across a giant surrounded by a crowd of people, and the giant is carrying a pair of scales in his hand, and his slogan is equality. He claims to have an easy solution to the problem of social and economic inequality, and it's worth reading quite a few stanzas of this episode, because it's one of the passages of the poem which is most resonant and most obviously applicable to modern political conversations. There they beheld a mighty giant stand upon a rock, and holding forth on high an huge great pair of balance in his hand, with which he boasted in his surquery, that all the world he would weigh equally, if aught he had the same to counterpoise, for want whereof he weighed vanity, and filled his balance full of idle toys, yet was admired much of fools, women, and boys. So Spenser's saying that he only has an audience among fools, women, and boys. He said that he would all the earth uptake, and all the sea, divided each from either. So would he of the fire one balance make, and one of the air, without or wind or weather. Then would he balance heaven and hell together, and all that did within them all contain, of all whose weight he would not miss a feather, and look what surplus did of each remain, he would to his own part restore the same again. So the giant is claiming that he can see the inequity, the inequality of the world, and he's got a simple answer to it. He can bring equality to everything. For why, he said, they all unequal were, and had encroached upon others' share, like as the sea, which plain he showed there, had worn the earth, so did the fire the air, so all the rest did others parts impair, and so will realms and nations run awry, all which he undertook for to repair, in sort as they were formed anciently, and all things would reduce unto equality. Therefore the vulgar did about him flock, and cluster thick unto his leasing's vein, like foolish flies about an honeycrook, in hope by him great benefit to gain, and uncontrolled freedom to obtain. All which when Artegall did see and hear, how he misled the simple people's train, in stainful wise he drew unto him near, and thus unto him spake, without regard or fear. And then Artegall then counters his arguments. And where did these arguments come from? The idea of bringing equality to an unequal world sounds quite modern. So what was the tradition in the Elizabethan period of this kind of argument? There was a radical tradition in England which had existed for at least 3 centuries. For example, John Ball, at about the time of the Peasants' Revolt, John Ball reportedly gave a sermon during the 14th century, where he asked, "When Adam delf and Eve span, who was then a gentleman?" So it's the idea that in the perfect condition of the Garden of Eden, there was no class system, but it was introduced later by trickery and oppression. And John Ball also said, that from the beginning all men were created equal by nature, and that servitude had been introduced by the unjust and evil oppression of men. So we can't go into too much detail about this tradition, but that gives you a general idea of where Spenser was getting these ideas from. And as I said, Artegall counters these ideas, firstly and most importantly by an appeal to providence, or to the power of God. So he says that God sets the rich on high and sets the poor in their place. And if God decides to set a poor man into a higher station, that's up to God. And if God decides to pull down a king, again, that's a matter for providence. But it's not for humans to try to overturn the order, because God has put everyone in their own respective place. This point might not sound very convincing today, but his second point is more compelling. Spenser argues that while the world may be unequal, its systems are far too complex to equalize from the top down, and any attempt to try to equalize it is going to just cause even more catastrophe and disaster. Interestingly, a similar argument was taken up by Cromwell and Ireton during the Civil War, and they realized that trying to rip apart the entire constitution is not the way to go. You have to change things piecemeal and slowly work towards your goals. After rebutting the giant's arguments, Artegall pushes him off a cliff to seal the deal. And Spenser uses an epic simile, we described those last time, to describe the giant's broken body. Like as a ship whom cruel tempest drives upon a rock with horrible dismay, her shattered ribs in thousand pieces rives, and spoiling all her gears and goodly ray, does make herself misfortune's piteous prey. So down the cliff the wretched giant tumbled, his battered balances in pieces lay, his timbered bones all broken rudely rumbled, so was the high aspiring with huge ruin humbled. So there ends the episode of the giant with the scales. Canto 3 narrates an episode between Braggadocio Florimel and Snowy Florimel, and I think we've talked enough about these characters in previous videos, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about that now, but if you're interested in following up on those characters, then Canto 3 is the place to find it. In Canto 4, Artegall rescues a knight called Sir Turpine, and he was about to be overcome by a mob of Amazons, and the Amazons represent female domination over man. And the idea is that men needed to guard themselves against women's desire for sovereignty, and this idea is developed in lots and lots of canonical works of literature. We might take Chaucer's Wife of Bath's tale, for example, where a knight manages to save his life by discovering what women allegedly want most in all the world. To every wight commanded was silence, and that the knight should tell an audience what thing that worldly woman loven best. This knight ne stood not still as doth a beast, but to his question anon answered, with manly voice that all the court it heard, My liege lady, generally, quod he, women desiring to have sovereignty as well over her husband as her love, and for to be in mastery him above. In all the court ne was their wife ne maid, ne widow that contraried what he said. So he concludes, he finds out the secret of what all women want most, and he claims that that's sovereignty over a man, and none of the women in the court disagree with that. A similar theme is developed in John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost, where God chastises Adam for following Eve into error. Was she, that's Eve, was she thy God, that her thou didst obey before his voice, or was she made thy guide, superior or but equal, that to her thou didst resign thy manhood, and the place wherein God set thee above her made of thee, and for thee, whose perfection far excelled hers in all real dignity. Adorned she was indeed, and lovely, to attract thy love, not thy subjection, and her gifts were such as under government well seemed, unseemly to bear rule, which was thy part and person, hadst thou known thyself aright. With these parallels in mind, we can return to the Faerie Queene. After Artegall has saved Sir Turpine from the Amazons, he chastises him for allowing him to get into that situation in the first place. Sir Turpine, hapless man, what make you here? Or have you lost yourself and your discretion, that ever in this wretched case you were? Or have you yielded you to provide oppression of women's power, that boast of men's subjection? Or else what other deadly dismal day is fallen on you by heaven's hard direction, that ye were run so fondly far astray, as for to lead yourself unto your own decay? And Turpine explains that the queen of the Amazons is a woman called Radigand, and whenever she defeats a knight, she strips him of every sign of masculine virtue and knighthood, and dresses him in women's clothes, and makes him do women's work like spinning wool. For all those knights, the which by force or guile she doth subdue, she foully doth entreat. First she doth them of warlike arms despoil, and clothe in women's weeds, that's clothes. And then with threat doth them compel to work, to earn their meat, to spin, to card, to sew, to wash, to wring. Ne does she give them any other thing to eat, but bread and water, or like feeble thing, them to disable from revenge adventuring. So she even restricts their diet in order to reduce their strength and to break their spirit. Artegall fights Radigand, and he's about to defeat her once and for all, but then she takes off her helmet, and Artegall sees that she's a beautiful woman, and he softens with pity. But then Radigand uses that to her advantage and uses it to defeat Artegall and take him captive. And then she strips him of his armor and makes him wear women's clothes and sets him to spinning wool and those other kinds of women's work which were described in the poem. An unfortunately common way of reading literature nowadays, whenever we come across a passage like this that flies in the face of modern views, is just to dismiss it as misogyny or sexism, or to say that Spenser was scared of powerful women or something silly like that. But I would suggest that that's a Puritan or a fundamentalist way of thinking, which interprets all human activity and artistic production, both past and present, in light of a rigid and preordained set of ideas. And this kind of reading is a very good way to make sure that you will never ever profit from what you read. But if you actually want to draw benefit from literature, then you need to have more of an open mind, I would say. A good piece of evidence that we're not dealing with misogyny here is the role of Britomart. We talked about her quite a lot in previous videos. And Britomart is a female knight who she sees a traditional area of male activity, so knighthood, and she thinks, well, I could do that, and perhaps even do a better job of it. And she signs up to the code of knighthood, and often defeats male knights, and really operates in this world and brings benefit to the traditionally male activity. And really, that's the essence of traditional feminism: seeing a traditionally male domain and thinking, I could contribute to that, perhaps even do a better job. And Radigand, on the other hand, represents a destructive hatred of masculinity, which is quite a different thing. And I think that's the distinction that Spenser is making, and I think that's why he considers Radigand and the Amazons to be so toxic and dangerous. Artegall is subsequently saved, in fact, by Britomart, and then Radigand is defeated. The rest of the book is largely dominated by historical allegory. Canto 8 has a battle between Prince Arthur and a sultan, or a Turkish prince, and this represents England's defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Canto 9 allegorizes the condemnation of Mary Queen of Scots, which happened after the Babington plot. And Cantos 10 to 11 represent the early years of the 80 Years' War, where English soldiers assisted Protestant rebels in the Netherlands to oppose the domination of Spain. Cantos 11 to 12 see Artegall finally complete his quest. He frees Irene from the tyranny of Grand Torto, and that represents, as we said, the liberation of Ireland from supposedly lawless rule. So that's a brief analysis of Book 5 of the poem. Next week I'll be talking about the 6th and final book, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next video.